Hi Maria, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you. Morning.
Have you both had a good week?
Busy week.
Pretty good week. Yes, pretty good week. Thank you. You?
Excellent. Yes, busy week with some good news in it this week. So all is good. So we're going to reflect today on something that happened a couple of weeks ago now. Just before we went live on one of our exploration sessions, the news broke about the situation at Next, where there's a legal case that had just been won for discrimination against women. And the women concerned worked in the Next shops, and the mostly male dominated workforce worked in the logistics in the warehouse. And as you pointed out, Maria, it was a catalyst for a really interesting session. And it took us into lots of different areas unexpectedly. I think I mentioned it just at the start of the session because it had literally just broken on the news. But it took us into a lot of areas and a lot of different things within different companies where they were starting to see legislation of that sort used in the way that perhaps it wasn't intended. And it opened up a really dynamic conversation. What were your reflections on it, Maria?
Well, my reflections on it were that using that type of scenario that many companies can relate to is a live issue for them, or wondering how to kind of move away from just responding to things into an actual sort of strategy that they could formulate, was that with the work that we're doing within the FRB in terms of trying to help companies move from sort of discussion to decision around their strategy, was that type of exercise and simulation almost, and working it through with the group through multiple angles of responsibility to a lesser or more extent, was actually, it really broadened out people's views of just their own box, just their own, this is my role, this is what I think about it. So they kind of moved away from something that assumptions that they'd made, things that were preconceived, and started to really understand different points of view, and that's got to be helpful for formulating any strategy, right? To be able to see things in the round.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because a lot of the issues we get into, you have a degree of subject matter experts, and so they see it in their box. I think one of the dynamics to that was a fairly familiar sounding problem to a lot of people who work in that sort of area was suddenly made public, and there was public opinion and public debate on it, which brought a different context to it. And you get a feeling as is this just or is this unjust? It brought a broader conversation on that sort of outside in view again, which is always such a challenge to get in. Sure, what were your thoughts?
Well, I guess I'm struggling with the case in question completely, and I think it's just because I must admit, you know, I'm not that close as the people that have obviously been involved, right? But as an outsider, you know, a warehouse worker does a very different job to someone in a real retail store, and that doesn't mean there might be 5-10% similarities, because I'm sure there are some things that are the same, but to me they're vastly different roles, and to my understanding is that, you know, the pay equality issue was or the defense was around the fact that the different roles and they're benchmarked differently. You know, they're competing for different resources than and therefore there was you know, you pay whatever the market pays to attract and retain the resource, right? And I think And I think that rings true. That's what everyone does in every role, regardless of this specific case. Every team in the world, as far as I'm aware, does some level of benchmarking and pays according to whatever the market. They can pay above market if they want, they can pay below market, but at least they're comparing it to what the market is offering, right? And therefore, to me, these are different roles, benchmarked differently, justifying different pay. But the court said, well, that wasn't good enough justification. And to me, that opens up a huge can of worms if that's the case, because almost every role in the country, forget these roles, a finance person versus an HR person versus a customer service person, whatever. It's all done through pay benchmarking. And actually, if they're saying, well, that's not good enough justification, well, then the ramifications, that is enormous, absolutely enormous. And then actually, if the girls win the case and they get paid quality in retail, I absolutely think this is a last nail in retail, because the cost inflation across retail is going to balloon substantially. That means significant shop closures to try and cover the costs. I just don't get it. I'm sorry. So I know I'm not close enough to it, but I'm really struggling with how this court case has gone.
Yeah, it seemed to go in two directions. One is they were sort of trying to prove that the actual work was similar, as in lifting the same boxes, because the people in the shops were unpacking, moving the boxes that the people in the logistics were moving. So the sort of manual side of the job was very similar. But then you get the as one of the people on the call took the conversation in a different direction. That is it a historical factor where mainly women working in shops were paid less than mainly men in the warehouse, which is also justified. It was quite interesting. But to try and put, I agree with you, Stuart, to try and equate those two things and not take any notice of how businesses go about finding a rate to pay their people is just crazy. And it's again an outside authority trying to look at something from a specific point of view. And we get that a lot when we're talking about responsibility and responsible business. We get people looking at an issue from a single perspective. And that's really, really difficult. When you take, even if it's bizarre, because even if that perspective is morally right, if you take that sort of thin, focused view from one perspective, it's very, very difficult to make decisions that are more rounded and that are good for all the different people, all the different stakeholders involved. So I think we see that a lot, and we've had it again this week. The Oasis thing with the tickets, and my mind immediately went to, well, that's how EasyJet started. Okay, and EasyJet broke the pricing model for seats on planes. If you're that old and you remember when EasyJet started, and suddenly cheaper flights were available because of that dynamic pricing structure. Now, let's not argue about whether cheap flights are good or not for the environment and that sort of thing, but that dynamic pricing is what broke that model from the traditional airlines. Well, again, what are your thoughts, Maria, on this? Because I think this is very much your environment. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I saw there was two examples that I thought about out of this sort of big Oasis of ticket booking event. So the first one was actually booking the tickets, and I did this. I went through this experience, and with my kind of online hat on, I always think online, if nothing else, it should be more convenient, always. And it was just awful. I would rather have just sat in a telephone queue listening to Oasis music than stay in a queue to get into another queue, to then have this really confusing sort of pricing model that kept changing and then kept kicking me out. So I think there was a couple of elements to that. So there was The dynamic pricing, so people paying a premium for a face value ticket essentially, and the the booking companies not just enabling it but forcing that through. Now one could argue that, well, maybe people shouldn't buy the tickets then, and then the price would go down. Well, of course it would, but that's just not going to happen. And so we sort of, when we benefit from dynamic pricing, it's kind of a normalized effect. But if it goes against what we want, then we complain about it. So I think that's just is what it is. But the sort of other side of that was just the whole online experience was absolutely horrible. And definitely could be, in my view, would be ripe for sort of redesign in some way. The other example that I saw was hotels. So this is like the halo effect of this. So hotels, particularly in Manchester, were then cancelling, once the dates had come out, were cancelling existing bookings in order to inflate the price for new bookings. So sort of market supply and demand, dynamic pricing in effect, but actually really frustrating customers that had made, that had made their bookings. But when you start to take all of this into the round, and let's take the hotel, for example, and its responsibilities. So it's definitely lowered its responsibilities to existing customers. Has it increased responsibility to its future customers by enabling those people that are going to be descending on Manchester to book a hotel room? Possibly, you could argue that. Has it improved its responsibility to its shareholders? Probably. Has it improved its responsibility to some short-term focus? Definitely. Will those hotels have actually thought through the sort of the full picture of what that means? I mean, chances are Oasis might have split up by the time that it comes round to that. So, is that one of the scenarios that's been considered in all of this? So, yeah, I thought it was a fascinating example of the online experience going horribly wrong, B, consumer kind of attitudes towards dynamic pricing when it doesn't go in their favor, and C, companies who could benefit from this event perhaps not thinking things through in the round as they might otherwise.
Yeah, the dynamic pricing is one thing. That the hotel, you could argue, acted in a more devious way, and pricing of tickets has always, if there's a big demand, the price has always gone up, whether it's online or trying to buy tickets as you walk into Wembley from Del Boy. But the trust thing is, I think the trust plan, this is absolutely huge, even to the effect where it's going to affect Oasis, and it's not even Oasis' fault, I don't think. Stuart, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree entirely with Maria. I think the experience on the buying of the tickets, I didn't try it, but I was literally out at the weekend with friends who were buying, and even when we were out, they were online trying to buy these tickets, and they were online for hours, absolutely hours, trying to get these tickets. And actually, one of the parts of the experience where I just thought was awful, absolutely awful, was like every hour and a half they got kicked off for whatever reason. They got kicked off, so they then get back on. And after doing this 2 or 3 times, literally an hour and a half, 2 hours at a time, they then got a message saying your behavior represents a bot, and therefore we're kicking you off. It's like, how bad is this? And it doesn't get any worse. And actually, I think one of the price issues, this ticket inflation issues, this dynamic pricing, is clearly if the internet was working well and everyone could get in minutes, they would have bought all the tickets in minutes. It wouldn't have taken hours. And I guess, whether dynamic pricing kicked in or not, it's almost irrelevant. I think, and if it was working well, that's how it should have worked, right? You could almost understand that if they hadn't sold all the tickets, or they'd got down to the last 1,000 tickets a week later, then they might kick in dynamic pricing on a time basis, that after a few days, after a week or something, they might start inflating the price to try and get the last stuff, and then they might start lowering it to sell the last ones, which is what happens in most companies. But to just willy-nilly, because of the internet not being able to handle the capacity to dynamically price while you're sat in a queue, and then if it's potluck who gets one price and who gets the next, I think is outrageous. I just think it's completely immoral. It's profiteering at its worst. And I think, Maria, you're right. The hotel situation where they're actually kicking people out of their rooms to then hike price. I'm sorry, that is just awful, absolutely awful. You can't justify that from a responsibility perspective anyway. That is a shocking profiteering thing, and honestly, I just hope people stop booking those hotels because period, because they deserve it. They absolutely deserve it. Rubbish.
I'm just interested here. I'm not asking anybody to name it. Do we know the hotel brand?
Yes,
we do know.
Yeah.
I'm not asking you because we're on YouTube and things. So it's interesting because I actually saw some reporting where I didn't see the brand. And I thought, oh, that's interesting because, if it was a brand I knew, it would be definitely be a black mark. But these companies have got to think of their brand. And these are the things that we come across with the responsible business again and again, where there is an opportunity to make what is in effect actually very little money. Even if they sold those rooms 4 times as much, they haven't got that many rooms. The amount of money that company will spend on its brand reputation, quite rightly, that's a tiny amount of money. So who made that decision? How did that come about for the hotel chain? And then we get into all sorts of discussions, and this is where we are a lot of the time with our thoughts about who makes the decisions in an organization, and what's guiding those decisions. Is it that short-term profit bit? Do they think they're being responsible to their shareholders or even to their employees? Could it be that the hotel is under threat or constantly under threat of not being able to keep a number of staff? So people are justifying their actions to say, well, okay, that's up to our profit, so I can retain 5 more staff during the year or something. I don't know. So those decisions are very difficult to make. It's easy for us to criticize from the outside and see the big picture. But when people are in those situations, how do companies guide that decision-making process? Because for all we know, there could be some people in the higher echelons of that hotel company putting their hair out and thinking, how the hell did that happen? We don't know.
Completely. And I think there's something else here, which is about the outsourcing of responsibility. And I am going to call out Oasis for this because, there have been artists and bands who have been very explicit about wanting fairness across their ticket pricing. So they want tickets to be accessible to as many fans as possible, right? So they have to cap the price in order to do that. And Oasis did put out a statement saying that, they weren't aware, and it wasn't, they kind of leave all that thing up to their management team and their promotion team. But actually, in a sense, in my view, that is outsourcing their responsibility as artists to the connection and the trust that they have with their fans. I think if we were to take that back into the business world, how many times do we see boards or the C-suite or even teams outsource their responsibilities to others, and then kind of go, well, I didn't know that was going to happen. I couldn't foresee that because someone else made that decision.
Yeah, interesting one, that one. I don't know what the relationship between the Gallaghers and the ticketing thing was. I'll ask him this afternoon, but it'll be interesting to see how that's set up.
Well, I just think if there's examples of other artists being able to do it, Ed Sheeran was one that kind of called out fair pricing. If other artists can do it, I'm sure Oasis could. Had that have been in their sphere of thinking.
Yeah,
I'm not saying they did it. It was intentional in any way, or But it goes back to that sort of unintended consequences, doesn't it? When you don't think these situations through in the round, when you do outsource certain responsibilities.
And it's an environment in which you do it. I guess I'm thinking back to my days in engineering and things, and there were some environments there. I walked into one environment that didn't outwardly condone that sort of pricing behaviour, but didn't stop it. And we had to change what was happening. Some people would call it the culture. I think it's a bit deeper than that, but we had to change it to stop those things occurring to people, to do that sort of thing. What are your thoughts here, Stuart? You led lots of organisations where people have to independently make decisions if they're in a call centre or wherever they are. How do you guide those decisions? What do you produce a framework? How do you do it?
Well, I think there's typically two ways, right? The companies do it, and I certainly know which ones outperform. But one does it through process and scripting and rules, right? So that those front line staff are basically not empowered. They're basically following a script and a rule book and a process, and thou shall not deviate from process. And the company prides itself by how many people stick to the process and do what they're told, right? And that's how they sort of recompense and reward. And that's sort of works to a degree if the processes are incredibly well formed and flexible to all circumstance, and the scripts, etc. likewise, right? But invariably that's never the case. There's so much grey in these things. It's not as black and white as people would like. The alternative way is where that there's very little scripting, and the process is the process to make sure that from a systems perspective or connectedness between one team and another, it all hangs together. But then there's a huge amount of latitude driven through a values-based culture to enable the frontline people to do what's right with the person in front of them. And sometimes they may get it wrong, but in my experience, 99.9% they get it right, and actually, you're empowering them to call those decisions, make those judgment calls in the moment. And a classic example for me where I've experienced this absolutely firsthand was when I had the pleasure of working for First Stretch and HSBC. The HSBC. We end up inheriting as a leadership team both the call centres for HSBC and First Stretch, and it was very, very clear that the way the HSBC stuff worked was very much process control, scripted, and in First Stretch there was so much more latitude. It was about driving the right ethos, the right values, the right thing from a customer endpoint viewpoint. And allowing the people to make whatever decisions they thought was right at the moment on the call, and from an experience perspective, and even from a financial perspective, if you take it like for like, because obviously HFC was 10 times the size, especially First Stretch outperformed. It even outperformed on a compliance perspective, which is quite interesting. So if you take a compliance regime, First Stretch outperformed their HSBC partners, yet HSBC was significantly more scripted than First Stretch.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we've done a classic here, really, from going from what's the responsibility at the top of the company to what's the responsibility at a call center level, because there's a thousand decisions made in between those two, and some of the one of the big telcos that I did quite a lot of work in, and Marie, you did some work in there as well. There was a lot of decisions in the middle piece, which you could loosely call senior executives or knowledge workers, I don't know how you term people, that were supposed to be there to use their experience and their knowledge to move things forward. But I felt that a lot of them there's no framework in there, nothing in there really, apart from a culture to guide those decision-making processes. And we saw good and we saw bad. And I always remember that some of the better decision-making processes or decisions I saw made, people were taking a risk against their own company rules and processes. in order to make good, responsible decisions. And it's I think in that middle piece as well, there's a real grey area. And how do we help that decision making process?
Well,
Small decisions.
I think part of that is also then, again, governance and process, because again, the companies I've worked for, the large companies, and again, I'm talking of large corporates like the HSBCs, and again, I'm not trying to denounce HSBC at all. It's a great company in a lot of ways, but yeah, you were a very small cog in a very large engine, and you owned almost zero decision-making power on your own, and to make a decision, you had to hold umpteen meetings with tens, hundreds of different people, and the decision making was laboriously slow because everyone had their say, everyone had their bit, and therefore you had to do a huge amount of socialization and discussion and input, and it just took forever. And then you go from a company like that to then Atom. When at one stage there was literally 6 of us around a table, and you would make more decisions a day, literally more decisions, and the big decisions in a day than I would make in 12 months in HSBC. And I swear, and that's what sometimes people love when they move to a small startup style organization, because of the freedom to make things happen, just to get on and make decisions. And sometimes you make bad decisions, but you know what? Just work in that environment, and it's not for everyone, because there's quite a lot of stress and pressure that goes to that. It's exhilarating compared to the boredom that you can get through some of the large corporates.
Yeah, I think part of what we're looking at for what we do going forward for FRB is try and help with some of that decision-making process. If you've ever, I sat and listened to a professor on decision-making some time ago, and the curve between the types of decisions you'll make and the length of time you make in the decision was just scary. Okay, so he said all you need to do is expand the time of the decision. If you go left or right changes, right? It's just incredible. So I think part of what we're looking at is how we go forward is how do we get more context around decision making? How do we engage with all the brain? Because what you're talking about there is probably a very highly intuitive environment at Atom. And remember, intuition is very good, but it can be dangerous as well. So you need to get these things right. Right? You need a mix of these things. And I think that's part of what's happening that we see with decision making and moving things forward in this environment, is that people that know it and understand it can be intuitive in it, but when it enters into a laborious decision-making process within the company, it gets buried, and things don't happen. Especially when you're looking forward and you're looking at future stuff, that decision-making process is really, really tricky. What are your thoughts, Marie? You're sort of nodding along there. You're looking pensive. I'm not sure if there's some pearl of wisdom about to come out.
Not at all, Carl. Not at all. It's Friday. It's been a hard week.
One of these days, Maria.
No, I'm just sort of reflecting a bit on what Stuart was saying, on my own experience, and I was a terrible employee in a corporate environment, precisely why, because of all the things that Stuart's kind of highlighted. But I think as well within a startup environment, which is more sort of my experience, the danger becomes then that you end up creating sort of multiple ecosystems, small ecosystems, because you've got people that are so keen to make decisions and make loads and loads of decisions that you can end up with all these ecosystems that end up spinning out their wheels a bit, because they're just, then they don't get anywhere, because you've got people just making decisions within their own situation, which can take you so far. It can get you up and running. It can get you to a point that you're performing to a certain extent, but then you do need to come together, or you do need to find a way to interconnect those ecosystems and those decisions that are being made, and just work through the clashes and the nuances, because everyone wants to get things done in a startup, and you don't want competing priorities, so you want to own everything. It's a natural instinct when you get into that environment.
But it's interesting, over the years I've done quite a lot of work with people working in large corporates, and there are ways of freeing up some of that decision-making process. Actually, it's not the norm, but it is an environment where you can sprinkle some different things in there to make it come alive, and get people into a more cognitive ease state, and allow things to happen. So you can do it. Some of it is about immersing people in a subject, so they're in a space where it's all there. And to lead back to where we were at the start of this conversation, is really when we had that conversation around Next, it inspired everybody to get into that place. And I think that's part of what we all saw about in that conversation, that it did immerse people in something a little bit different, but it freed up their own thing. And before we know it, some of the people were talking about different things within their own organization that we hadn't heard of before. So I think you can do that. I think it's about stimulating the right environment. So thank you, guys. We've just got a minute over our time. So any last thoughts from people? No, we're going to end on top, almost on time. So thank you very much, guys. Have a good weekend. Have a good weekend, everybody. And I shall get hold of the Gallaghers and see what they think, Maria. And I'm sure they'll be sending you nice tickets, inviting you on stage to join.